Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Not Minding My Own Business. I am your estate planning and elder law attorney, Russell Farbiars, and I am joined here today by my good friend, Jason Hornberger from Orrstown Bank. Welcome, Jason.
Hey, thanks, Russell.
So what our listeners don't know, Jason, is that you are essentially were guest zero on this podcast because my first foray into doing, a a show in this context was a Facebook live event that you and I did back in, was it 2021, I believe.
It was a
Uh,
pandemic year. That's all I know. I was in my
y-
basement.
yeah, you aren't you still in your basement?
Oh, so I moved upstairs. I think that was
Oh,
something with the pandemic. I got to upgrade everything. So the walls of my office are finally painted and it looks a whole lot better. So now I'm up here now.
yes, but we did this. You know, Jason, if for anyone who doesn't know, is essentially a local hero because Jason has not once but twice been a an organ donor, and so that's what we talked about on that Facebook Live. And so anyone who's interested, it's on our YouTube channel. Certainly check it out. But that was sort of the pre podcast, and the motivation to want to tell these stories of local business leaders and folks like Jason. But we're not here to talk about organ transplant, although we can. But we're here to talk about really a much gloomier subject, which is preparing for death. So, Jason, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about what you did recently, and why you did it?
Yeah, well, and I think that podcast that we did a few years ago kind of feeds into why I've been doing all this stuff lately as well. Of when you go through life, there's a bunch of different things that'll inspire you to make plans and to have those real big boy grown up things that you have to do of with doing the estate planning, getting a will together. I know a lot of people drag their feet on it, say I'm just not ready to do it yet, but I've had a lot of perspective in the last couple
Mhm.
of years, and even going back to when we did that podcast of when I was an organ donor for the first time. That was right when I did my first will and getting the estate documents together for the first time. And my daughter, it was the first time I got things together. My daughter was born. My parents were living in actually the in-laws quarters in my basement at the time, and my situation was really different. So I knew I was going into surgery. I knew I had my daughter. I had this strange situation where my parents were relying on me as for a place to live. Not that they needed me to, but they were there. So it was really thoughtful when I did my documents the first time around. And then over the last year and change, had a lot of life events of my. But I had surgery again. We were blessed with my son. So my kids are 7 and 5 now, and I just thought about those documents and realized things have changed a lot. My parents had moved out; they bought a place in Florida. My sister got diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and she's fighting the fight every day. She's doing amazing, but life is just different. And I had this moment of realization that there's so many things that we don't know, but I shifted all those emotional things when you think about death, when you think about the sad part. I shifted in all the business. I work really hard in my business and I read everything I can about how to be a good salesperson, a good leader, a good banker. And I just took those principles of controlling what I can, of thinking how many steps ahead. And I took those principles and really decided to make a plan that I'm not going to be anybody's burden when something happens to me. So I drew out a really I made the plan, surrounded myself with smart people. So Russell, I called you, and
Thank you.
we dove into my documents, and I took it even one step further, which we'll talk about later, about really working on a letter of instruction, which I probably went further than anybody else has that I know of that has ever done. But I thought it was a really cool idea, and wasn't morbid. It wasn't. Um, wasn't strange at all, but I actually did a death rehearsal. My best friend, who was going to act as my executor, he literally came over and we walked through the entire process of what's going to happen. So it's just very strange. We took all the emotion out of it. We laughed about it, and we're all just prepared for what inevitably is going to happen, because there's only two things sure in life, and death and taxes, right? And we get really sad, or or we can laugh about it for either one of those topics.
And that's very true. And the one of the best gifts that you can give your family is having a very thought out plan for what happens when you pass, because there's nothing worse than a family saying, well, gee, I don't know what dad had, I don't know where it is, I don't, you create a lot of unnecessary stress at a time when people are grieving. So it, you know as is the custom for you, Jason, you have taken it one step further with the letter of instruction. But anyone who knows Jason knows that is Jason's personality. It's all a good thing. But tell me a little bit about what you put in this letter of instruction.
Well, I went to just the extreme of thinking. I think the first time we did set up a letter of instruction for both me and my wife, and we originally wrote it in this romantic text. It was almost it wasn't quite poetry, but it was just thanking the person who's executing on it, of what our wishes were for our children, how we'd want them to be raised, how we preferred things to be done. But at the end of the day, it was both of us. If something were to happen to us, we wrote it more in the context of the way we'd want our kids to be raised, and that letter to the future guardians, of who that was, and really why. My wife and I both have two sisters, and we have very good friends, and who we chose in that scenario, there's going to be a lot of question of why wasn't it our parents? Why wasn't it one sister versus another? Why was it a friend? But across the board, we wanted to give that compliment to the person that we did choose for, and say exactly what the reasons are, so it didn't create conflict. So there were a lot of things in there, but we wrote that first letter, and this is going back the 6 years ago, with that very much being our intent and our complete role on it. And at the time, we had built our house only a couple of years before. We had some very strange perceptions. When I look back on it in retrospect, I had provisions in there written out that if you wanted to, if you were the guardians, you'd get to take the house. That I really wanted the kids to grow up in this house that we built. And if my wife and I, and now we have so much more perspective after living what we're living with my sister, and everything else, that's really silly. If we're both gone, we're just really grateful that somebody is willing to take care of our kids. So things change a lot over time. We had different perceptions. And this last time that it came around, this was a very personal thing for me, that if I were to go, if something were to happen to me, that scenario, that if it's just, or if my wife and I were to go at the same time, that's the way we wrote it before. This time around, I wrote a very detailed step-by-step instruction of, this is every asset that I have. This is who you call to shut it down, simplify. This is the passcodes to get into my computer, how to get into my phone, where the documents are located, how to get into the safe. And when we did the rehearsal, it was literally, can you follow these instructions? Are they actually good? And it was kind of funny. It was basically like a scavenger hunt to go around my house to make sure he knew how to get into everything. And yeah, you can get it really detailed in those things. And I am absurdly detailed, and it went really well.
So when you called your friend to say, I want to do a death rehearsal, can you tell us a little bit about that conversation? How did that go?
Well, I think my friends know me of everything I've been going through, and this has been a lot of weight on me. I struggled with trying to really figure out what my role was with my when my sister got sick, and I ended up becoming the old church lady. I would make freezer meals and bring them over, and help everywhere else I was asked. So my best friend, he's an attorney in Philadelphia. He's very, very smart, but he understands all the different things that go through my head. We've been best friends since high school. So he wasn't all that surprised, and I think he basically knew in his own mind that this is a very smart thing to do, and maybe for my own mental health, he knew it was just good to say yes to whatever I asked for.
Yeah, I just imagine it's not the most normal request, come over to my house, we're gonna drink a couple beers and then we're gonna pretend that I'm dead, but
I was very specific. I had a bottle of Redemption whiskey actually, and
with it,
and it
there
was
we go.
actually really funny. In a strange way, it was this. I hope it's life imitating art, or vice versa, however you would say that. It, if and when he ever has to do that duty, oh, it will be him sitting in that room and me being there as a ghost holding a glass of whiskey, and he can laugh about it through that entire moment. So it was a very strange thing that it's a memory, but it's just like sports of you practice things for a reason. That when you do something the second, third, fourth time, that we're not going to practice it that many times. That would be taking it too far
Yeah.
beyond the extreme. But to do it a second time will make it a whole lot easier to know where the safe is, how to open it, where the passcodes are. And I think everybody forgets about, you have so many digital assets, and just I might have all the details on my computer, but if he doesn't know where the password is and how to get into it, all that stuff is lost.
Right. And I think that what you've brought up, at least two things that are interesting to talk about. One is the idea that, and I tell this to my clients all the time, that estate planning is not a once and done activity. It's a lifetime process. So, it's nice to hear that you said, I did this 6 years ago, or 7 years ago, whatever it was, but you recognize that you need to continue to look at it and be reflective as to whether it matches your wishes. And you made some changes. I'm not going to ask you what those changes are, but obviously, did you find that process helpful to be continually looking at your documents?
Oh, absolutely. And just when we looked at it and looking back, I mentioned even things that we put in there, but from even the letter of instruction and our will, of we had provisions in there that just made no sense anymore.
Right.
My parents don't live at my house anymore. There didn't need to be special provisions for them anymore. We had an additional kid with my son. We had so many things in our life had changed, and just thinking of, we had a new perspective basically of recognizing of and going through recognizing what my role is in life. Of when called, I'm going to help somebody in need. And you can look
Hmm.
at when I was a living donor, what I do in the community. um, that is basically my mantra in life, that who am I to say no when I'm called? So I wait to be called. I'm not going to be a burden on somebody else. And I learned this with my sister. There's a lot of people that wanted to help her, and
Hmm.
sometimes when showing up, people would show up and try to help, but they were actually making more of a burden when they did that.
Right.
So I wanted to be really specific and be thoughtful to, maybe we had one thought about how we wanted our kids to be raised, but from a perspective of who we're asking for help, you need to be really specific in that. And or at least that's where we are in our lives. So we wanted to make sure it was people who are able to help. We weren't putting a burden on people that don't have that capacity. So it was just a major change in where we are in our lives from just 6 years different. And maybe that was too long even. There was everything changed in our lives during that
Well,
stretch. So it's definitely a continual process, and we'll be looking at it again for sure.
yeah, and in our practice, we actually include a complimentary review, typically 3 years after a plan is executed. And not everyone needs that review or takes advantage of that review, but the point of it is exactly what you said. Maybe 6 years was too long. Maybe where you are in life, yes. But for someone who's a lot older, maybe not. But it's still important that you continually look at these documents and make sure that they reflect your present wishes, not your wishes from the past. Um, so yeah, I think it's great that you went through that process. The other thing you mentioned is digital assets, and I don't think that we could spend an hour, talking about digital assets, but it's, you know, you think about, we all have things like Facebook, and we have social media, and our banking is all done electronically. Recently had an estate client come to me and say, I can't find any bank statements because mom must have done everything online. Well, you don't think about that, but then you don't, there's nothing there to be found. So it's what you're talking about with passcodes is just incredibly important. Now, I'm going to ask you though, did you do anything with your Facebook page?
Not yet.
Okay.
So I think that is, I have the password prepared for it, that can be at the discretion of who's ever taking care of things. And I think that's why I have it written right now, but
Right.
there'll be updates over time. I didn't get to everything, Russell.
I'm just want to point these things out, that, there are a lot of these social media companies, they have the ability to, you can actually appoint a legacy contact. So you can appoint someone who then, if you die, is able to manage those assets, and maybe, maybe it's because you want your account to be deleted when you pass. You don't want it, just sitting out there. Or maybe it's because you want to convert it into some sort of memorial page, or you want to at least have those options. It also by going through these legacy procedures, it can make it a lot easier for your loved ones to access assets or access information when they need it. So, and have you, what have you done to make things easier to access that information for your loved ones?
Yeah, it's mostly just providing the passcodes for everything, and it's things you don't realize. I'm not a holder of Bitcoin or those types of real hard. I don't, you can't even call that hard. Totally different podcast, Russell.
Yeah.
But there are all sorts of things we don't think about, whether it's just like a movies anywhere account where you just have a bunch of movies you've purchased for a long time.
Yes.
Does that get lost? Your iTunes, across the board, there are things that we spent money on collecting digital things that just get lost. So those are some of the little things I started to get granular on, but yeah, I'm sure I could dive a whole heck of a lot deeper into it too. That there's more things I don't even realize, but it's just another world that that generation before didn't really have to think about.
No, it used to be, that people went into they went to their parents' house after they passed, and they found a whole stack of statements, and they'd bring them in, and then we know what we were dealing with. Well, that's not the case anymore. Everything is digital, and it's become more digital over the last 3 to 5 years. So, uh, you know, tip the cap to you for recognizing that and getting all of that stuff in order. Uh, Now, as part of your plan, have you I'm sure you have, but have you considered organ donation?
Yep. Oh, for whatever's left of me.
Yeah,
Right.
I understand that you pretty much, give them away now as party gifts, but
Yeah.
you know, I- and maybe explain for our listeners how you go about making those choices so that they can be executed upon it at the end of your life.
Yeah, thanks, Russell. So, organ donation. I know we're in May now. April was my big speaking engagement month for Organ Donor Awareness Month, but we'll bring it into May. I still my number one reason for doing all of this was to honor my mother-in-law, who was a donor when she passed. It was a big deal for her. She was a nurse, Tammy Schaefer, and was her name. And my wife was 11 when she passed. When she had designated on her driver's license, so when you renew your license, you can get the designation on there. It does not cost you anything to do it, but it is one way to communicate that that's your wish. But even when my wife's mother passed, there was a lot of thought and discussion and disagreement amongst her family as to what the right thing to do. So overall, if you want to make sure, and the ultimate decision that gets made is your family knows that that's your wish, that you want to be a donor when you pass. It doesn't work in every situation. but overall, the way the numbers work, I was a two-time living donor. I donated my liver and my kidney. If it was an opt-out system versus an opt-in, there would be no need for living donors. There would just be enough. And I don't know right off the top of my head exactly what the number is right now, but there are 100, I think 100,000+ people waiting for a kidney at any given moment, and it's an absurd number. So definitely recommend it. Definitely make sure your family knows that it's something you want to do, because ultimately they're going to be the ones who make the decision.
Right. I think that all of this really comes down to communication and laying out what your intentions are for your family, because most of the time the family wants to do what you want, what their loved one wants to do. They just need to know what that is. So
And you
if
can have it in your documentation as well. That can certainly help make the communication better if you have it in your state documentation.
Sure. So if you are if someone is looking at, getting started with, trying to do this documentation, not necessarily the legal documentation, but the letter of instruction, or they want to do a rehearsal, where do you start? What are your first steps?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. I trying to think back. I don't know exactly where I started, but when the idea got in my head that I just wanted to be really organized, and I wanted to make sure that I was just in as much control as I could be, even when I'm not around, that I'm at least helping that awkward time that I'm putting a burden on somebody else. I started just Googling different topics to see what are the things I should know, what are the things I should be including on those lists. So there's a lot of information out there. My wife actually held an event that there was a speaker for a book that came in, and the book was literally called "What Happens If I Get Hit by a Bus," and I read that book. So there's lots of resources out there that you can just find online. It's incredible these days. But overall, if you just sit down and think, and I took my business approach of the approaches and the ways I think when I'm working with a client of what is the next step. And if you just play it out like a dress rehearsal, what are the things that are there? And if you go a month and think about everything you do through the course of the month, those are all the things that are going to happen whether you're here or not. So I just made a list of those things, and as time went on, and I just made sure I added it to the list, and I wrote instructions of how to take care of everything if I'm not here. Maybe I get to go away for a month-long vacation too. Life will just go on without me. And shame on me if I don't figure out how.
Yeah. I mean, that makes perfect sense. Online resources, for any of our listeners out there that are looking for resources, we have a blog on our website, and we try to address some of these sort of questions to get people thinking on these topics. And there's lots of articles and information out there. Now, Jason, before we let you go, I want to hear a little bit about the work that you do for Orrstown Bank.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm the commercial lender here in Berks County. They hired me, it's going to be almost 5 years ago, actually.
Wow.
So about a year before the pandemic. And I came in as the guy in Berks County to build the market from scratch. I never thought the pandemic that we'd live through the pandemic, but that's been the majority of my time in my role. So I have goals for loans, for deposits, both personal and for businesses. But overall, I work with all types of businesses and nonprofits. And my job, especially living through the pandemic, I just create value where I can give advice, where I can just help with every transaction. My job is to make life easier for you. So overall, I work with businesses, and I try to bring value in every way that I can, and that's what I do.
And Jason does make life easier. He has done some work for me, and has made my life a lot easier. So definitely achieving that goal.
Thank you, Russell. And overall, I recognize my job's just different. I went out of my way to just differentiate.
Mhm.
I think we all try to put together elevator pitches. I narrowed it down to 3 words of personal, professional, and oh my goodness, now I'm even losing it. But overall, it's I bring a very genuine approach, and
Mhm.
I'm not going to try to be anybody else. If I just try to bring value. So there's a lot of banks where there's a lot of big banks out there these days, and this
Yes.
Orrstown is definitely a place where I get to be an individual. I get to just bring value to my clients, and we're told I worked for much bigger banks before, and they said do it the big bank way. This is a very unique place where we get to try to make Orrstown better. I actually went into a meeting once and said that we're an island of misfit toys of really talented people that just work really hard and make the place better. So it's a fun culture and something I really enjoy.
Well, wonderful. And if anyone is looking to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to get you?
Yeah. So my information is pretty easy to find. If you look on LinkedIn, Jason Hornberger, all my information is there. So whether you email or call me, very easy to find.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jason. I really enjoyed this conversation talking about what can be a very depressing topic, but really about the importance of making a plan. So thank you for being here with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Russell.